purchased after 2.5 years of open warfare, decades of violent encroachment, and the defeat of a pan-Indian movement to keep settlers out of the Great Lakes region at the Treaty of Chicago in 1821, receiving their final payment before moving westward in 1835. The area was also a site of trade, gathering, and a healing for more than a dozen other Native tribes. The state of Illinois is currently home to more than 75,000 tribal members, and the Chicagoland area is currently home to one of the largest and most diverse urban Native communities in the US. Illinois is also the territory of the Ho-Chunk, Miami, Anoka, Menominee, Sauk, Fox, and their descendants. By making a land acknowledgement, we recognize that Indigenous people are the traditional stewards of the land that we now occupy, living here long before Chicago was a city, and still thriving here today. As we work, live, and play on these territories, we must ask what we can do to right the historic wrongs of colonization and state violence and support Indigenous communities' struggles for self-determination and sovereignty. My name is Ade Kemi, and I'm the president of the Urban Planning and Policy Student Association. I welcome you to the 12th Annual Urban Innovation Symposium, Reshaping the Normal. The symposium is presented by the student organizations and UIC's College of Urban Planning and Public Affairs, the Latinx Planning Organization for Development, Education, and Regeneration, El Poder, Women in Planning and Public Affairs, WIPA, Society for Black Urban Planners, ESPA, and the Urban Planning and Policy Student Association, UPPSA. This event would not have been possible without the symposium committee members, Hamali Shingale, Molly Clark, Irene Henry, Chelsea Moore, and Carlos Velasco, and financial support from CUPPA's Urban Planning and Policy Program. This two-day symposium seeks to offer reflective space for emerging planners and professionals. We encourage each of you to engage with the theme, Reshaping the Normal, as 4 panels will consider what is deemed as normal within planning and beyond. Now, without further ado, Henry Siegel, representing the Urban Planning and Policy Student Association, will begin with our first panel.
Awesome. Thanks, Ade Kemi. All right, let me just share my screen real quick. All right, so can everyone see my screen? Okay. All right, well, welcome everyone to UIC's Urban Innovation Symposium. We are excited to have you all here for our panel, Improving the Built Environment, Improving the Health of People. Before I begin, I just want to share with you all our community guidelines for this event. So first, please keep yourself muted unless you're asking a question during the Q&A. Please avoid tone policing. If possible, please have your video on when asking questions or engaging with the panelists. Listen with love, use active listening and humble listening. Challenge the idea, not the person. Be open to making mistakes. And also signal when you don't understand jargon. You can do that by putting question marks in the chat, and then that can notify us and our people who are managing the chat if you don't understand something and help you with that. Okay, so moving right along, just want to set the stage really quick for this particular panel. So we're excited to bring this panel of experts here to provide an opportunity to explore and discuss our growing responsibilities as planners and urbanists to take a more conscious look at how we can shape cities to promote better public health outcomes. COVID-19 highlighted the underlying weaknesses of our health systems nationally, along with the deeply rooted health inequities present in local neighborhoods and across cities. As the country and cities all across the country are continuously adapting to dynamic but waning changes in COVID-19 conditions, it offers a new branching off point to reevaluate how new and traditional practices and policies can be used to create spaces that thoughtfully seek to make the health of communities a cornerstone. The intersections in planning and public health are especially pressing in the wake of COVID-19. We must take on new roles or support those that already exist to promote equitable, healthy, and thriving communities. Our panelists will bring historical insights and knowledge to guide how the lessons of the past continue to inform how cities can be shaped for longevity and people's well-being. I'm going to start by introducing our wonderful panelists for today. First, we have Kyle Shelton. Kyle is the director of the University of Minnesota Center for Transportation Studies. He has led research and policy work in transportation, urban development, and housing. Prior to joining the University of Minnesota, he was the deputy director at Rice University's Kinder Institute for Urban Research. There, he led several research programs and oversaw external partnerships. And Sheldon has a PhD in American Urban History from the University of Texas at Austin. He is also the author of Power Moves, Transportation, Politics, and Development in Houston. Next, we have Lindsey Realmuto. Lindsey is a third-year PhD student in the Urban Planning and Policy Department at UIC. She came to UIC with 10 years of experience working in the public health field with a focus on better understanding the health impacts of the built environment. Her dissertation research will critically assess the health promotion promises of new urbanist type zoning reforms and question whether the adoption of these types of zoning strategies are associated with the incidence of gentrification and displacement, potentially increasing health disparities. She has a master's in public health from George Washington University and a bachelor's degree in Latin American studies from Tulane University. Next up, we have Stephanie Phillips. Stephanie is a San Antonio-based senior public policy and planning professional working at the intersection of heritage conservation and sustainability. She leads the City of San Antonio's deconstruction program, which aims to maximize material salvage and reuse opportunities from older structures while advancing the city's climate action, affordable housing, and workforce development goals, all through a heritage conservation lens. Stephanie holds an MS in historic preservation from the University of Texas at Austin and a BS in interior architecture from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. And last, but certainly not least, we have Julia Gerasimenko. Julia is an advocacy manager with the Active Transportation Alliance. Her favorite way to get around is the bus or electric divvy bike. She has never owned a car and has always been intrigued by the freedom and flexibility that transit provides. She was inspired by growing up a Metro North ride away from the New York City's transit system and the ever-expanding transit system of her birthplace, Moscow. In a previous job, she worked with Chicagoland high school and college students and witnessed how a lack of affordable, frequent transit service impacts educational access. That radicalized her to get involved in transportation advocacy, and it has been almost 5 years since she joined Active Transportation Alliance. All right, those are our panelists for today. I just want to give them a quick little round of applause before we get going. I know it's a Zoom, but I just like to give a little give in the chat or do the icon. But I'm going to get started here with our very first question. And so panelists, I will direct each one of these questions to you. Of course, if there's anything anyone specifically wants to interject with that's out of turn, after we go through everyone, please just let me know. We do want to encourage this to be somewhat of a conversation as well. So the first question, and this is going to be directed first to Lindsey. Broadly speaking, how does public health or general health and well-being factor into your work or the goals and mission of your organization?
Hi, Henry, and hello, everyone. I just want to start by saying thank you so much for inviting me to present today. If it wasn't obvious by my bio that Henry shared, public health and the built environment and how those intersect have been sort of fundamentally part of my professional career. Starting in my master's program, I was really interested, my focus in my master's program in public health was around environmental and occupational health. And I was always very fascinated more with the built environment side of things. And following my master's program, I've always tried to find myself in a position where I'm working on issues that relate to those. I think as I've moved forward and in pursuing the PhD here at UIC in urban planning, my main focus and goal is really to be an interdisciplinary researcher that's furthering our understanding of how public health and planning are related and how we can really create healthier and more equitable cities. And I think the equity part for me is increasingly more and more part of my focus in terms of my research and my studies here at UIC. But yeah, that sort of sums me up.
Awesome. Thank you, Lindsey. Next up, we're going to start with Kyle. We're going to go with Kyle.
Sure. Hi, Henry. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me as well. I would say generally, so the Center for Transportation Studies is a university-wide entity, so I'm not going to successfully speak for everybody who's working in this space, but what I would say generally that what we try to do, and my perspective as the director, is that in a lot of ways, public health and health considerations in general and transportation are too often sort of backburnered, right? We spend a lot of time with the IIJA, the infrastructure bill, talking about what that means for new structures, new bridges, new roadways, new other big projects like that. And we're not often really we're too rarely framing it as well through really critical, I would say, parallel and really necessarily supportive subjects like health. And so a lot of our researchers at the university, and certainly some of my own interest, is in thinking about how we tie health outcomes and health considerations amongst many others into our transportation decision-making and transportation systems. Thinking about things like access to literal healthcare and sites of service that folks need by different modes, but then also, of course, really critical topics like safety on our roads for all users, and safety in our communities, no matter how people choose to move or have to move through their days, I think are both places that we're spending a lot of time. And then the last one I would say is, I think that we are at a moment where we set a lot of really great big goals collectively, whether it's at the federal level or local levels, on things like climate change or on health outcomes and equity. And one of the challenges I think we have now is really ensuring that the execution of strategies to get to those goals and achieve those goals is, at the moment, I would say, lacking. We've done a really good job of saying these are our goals. But when, to use what I'm sure will be the first of many transportation metaphors that I just use instinctively at this point, where the rubber meets the road, is actually doing those projects and saying, okay, we've set this goal for 2035. We have to actually start pursuing projects that help us address it. So I'd say those three big areas are things that I've been working on and that our center and researchers at the university do.
Great, thank you, Kyle. Okay, next up, I'm gonna have Stephanie go.
All right, thanks all. It's great to be virtually with you in Chicago. I'm originally from Milwaukee, so anytime I get to pop back up to the Midwest, it gives me a lot of joy. So as you heard in the introduction, I work for the city of San Antonio, so a municipal office. I work for the Office of Historic Preservation, which is probably a unique aspect considering public health for some people, but we think it's integral. And I'll kind of share why. The mission of our office is to protect the historic, cultural, architectural, archaeological, and environmental resources that make San Antonio unique. Big challenge. But when considering public health, our work is largely guided by the social determinants of health, specifically the three that focus on economic stability, neighborhood and the built environment, and then social and community context. Now, for us, it can be a challenge to kind of deliver data-backed evidence on some of the more anecdotal and experiential qualities of community health, especially considering the built environment. So in the past few years, we've made it a priority to commission studies on how heritage conservation plays a role in health, affordable housing, and sustainability. And some of the examples that we've learned specific to San Antonio include how our historic districts are more walkable than the rest of the city, with a walk score of 66 compared to 34 citywide. If you're not familiar with San Antonio, it has a major sprawl problem. So transportation and walkability are huge, huge issues here right now. Our historic districts also have more trees per acre than neighborhoods in the rest of the city, which means that they sequester more carbon, they use less water, and they use less energy than the rest of the city. And then building on the first point, our historic neighborhoods have greater transit access than the rest of the city because they were inherently built around the transit that may not exist anymore, like streetcar lines that have been replaced for our car-centric American ideology. So every passing year, our focus on climate and public health just continues to grow, and so does our associated policy and program strategies. And we see a lot of our work is integral to the discussions around how to mitigate our climate emergency, so that we have initiatives titled Climate Heritage and Circular Heritage, tying into the concept of the circular economy and reducing waste and improving resiliency. So in this way, public health is really integral to our work, and we're really trying to make it a point for our office, because we have more resources than a lot of preservation offices, to kind of serve as a model for how our profession overall can be more intersectional.
Amazing, thank you, Stephanie. All right, Julia, you're up next.
Thanks so much for having me, and hello to everybody. So I work at the Active Transportation Alliance. We're based here in Chicago, but we're a regional organization. We're a nonprofit advocacy group working to promote walking, biking, and public transit to create healthy, sustainable, and more equitable communities. So it's right there in our mission, how our work relates. And our two kind of primary strategic goals that we work towards every day. One is to reduce severe crashes and fatalities, otherwise known as Vision Zero in some parts, and then also to shift trips away from single occupancy vehicles or cars to walking, biking, and transit. So we work on policies at various levels, but I think I have a couple of anecdotes that I think help highlight the connection between transit, specifically transportation, and health. So one I want to share is the Blue Cross Blue Shield of North Carolina recently did a study on how the primary factor of rehospitalization for individuals was actually whether they had a ride home or not. And so I think that really highlights how transportation really is the great connector, right? Both to communities, to opportunity for social networks, right? So I just found that really fascinating. Another that I heard early on at my time at Active Trans was looking at hospitalization rates of kids with asthma in Atlanta during the Olympics there, when they shut down the city center to car traffic, and it was a really dramatic decline in hospitalization rates. And then you look at Chicago, right? So the community advocates who protested for many years to get a trauma center on the South Side, right? How many lives could have been saved if there was a more accessible transit system and hospital on the South Side for victims of violence? Or even what if there was an Ashland bus rapid transit line, and a couple years ago there was a baby born on the Ashland bus? What if there had been a bus lane and that baby had been able to get to the hospital sooner, right? So these are the kinds of things I think about in our work of how health and transportation relate. And we like to say at Active Trans that cars make us sick, poor, and unequal. So I think those three anecdotes kind of highlight that. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you so much, Julia. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to our next question. Thank you all for such a great overview of your organizations and how it relates to health. So this first question is going to be directed first to Julia, and then we'll go to Kyle, and then Stephanie, and then Lindsey. I will also direct that if you don't remember. So first question is, how do you think COVID-19 has impacted the way we as planners or advocates understand the built environment and its role in either positively or negatively impacting the health of urban residents? And so we'll start with you, Julia.
Yeah, I mean, goodness, it's certainly impacted the way we think about things. And I think just kind of underscored how important public transportation is, right? So at the beginning of the pandemic, we were kind of trying to use the tagline that transit is an extension of our public health system, right? It was getting people to and from work, to and from COVID tests and all of that. So it's also been a really precarious time for transit in terms of funding, right? So in Chicago, 50% of revenue needs to come from riders paying their fares, and that's balanced across CTA, PACE, and Metra. And so that means when ridership takes a huge hit, so does transit funding. I think it's kind of underscored how much of a public good and public necessity that transit is. And so as an organization, you know, we were originally founded as the Chicagoland Bicycle Federation. Then about over a decade ago, we became more multimodal. It underscores that we really need to center transit in our advocacy with regards to racial equity, and specifically buses as well. When you look at ridership rates during the pandemic, like just in Chicago, train ridership decreased much more than bus ridership. And I think that's due to the fact that people have been priced out of living close to train lines. And so people who are lower income, people of color are more likely to depend on Chicago's buses than Chicago's trains due to housing costs. So I guess, and then simply when you think about the fact that it's an airborne illness, right? So thinking about air quality and how, we might want to introduce, a network of protected bike lanes, but for environmental justice communities who don't even feel okay taking a walk outside due to the air quality in their communities, how are we both promoting a safer environment for them and keeping them healthy so they're not more susceptible to this airborne illness, right? So yeah, I think it's really shaped the way we think about things and making sure we're centering the most vulnerable in our work.
Thanks, Julia. Okay, Kyle, do you want to take on this
Sure.
this question
Thanks,
as well?
Henry. And yeah, I'll build on some of what Julia said and also try to push in a couple different places as well. So I think the way that I've been thinking about it a lot is that it really has highlighted a lot of the, I think, existing cracks or gaps in our planning, right? So from what Julia was mentioning, like the transportation systems that we have being really oriented around, central city or job center commuters, and thinking about the travel that we have valued with our planning decisions being those 9 to 5 locations more than anything else, right? And the level of investment that we give into the infrastructure to support that type of daily travel pattern. I think it really became clear that without that there, the systems that we created seem superfluous in a lot of ways, right? When we talk about, oh, look, the transit numbers have dropped so far on this commuter line. It's because the line was created to move people to jobs at peak hours, and when those folks are working from home or in the middle of a medical pandemic, a health pandemic, those riders aren't there. So it really highlights not just what Julia said about those places where it really is critical service, right? The local buses and the non-peak hours, and really showing folks do need those options and need those systems in place. I think it also really showed a great deal about where we had underinvested, not just in transit, but in active transportation infrastructure. And I'm sure Julia could expound on this as well, but there's lots of coverage and lots of important outcomes around people becoming more active and getting out of the house in different ways and using public amenities and trails and other structures like that. And I think it's very apparent across most of the United States and much of the world that the level of investment and access to those amenities was also limited. And so that's certainly a area for continued exploration as well, to think about how we ensure that folks all have access to that those places are safe and aren't, as Julia mentioned, compounding other health issues. And then I do think, not to be all doom and gloom, I think one of the things that's really important about this moment too is that rather than, and we've been thinking a lot about this with some questions locally here, rather than saying, okay, transit ridership dropped considerably, isn't that a sign that we don't need transit? I think the challenge for planners and advocates and everybody who relies on a range of modes to move through the day right now is instead to say, what is the future of mobility and transportation that we want, right? So yes, the current system, the system that we created that we are all acknowledging as worker commuter and auto dependent more than anything else, has had a lot of changes. That doesn't mean that we abandon transit. It doesn't mean we abandon active transportation and double down on auto dependency necessarily. I think it's a great opportunity for us to say, how do we acknowledge the way that our society moves and the destinations people are going to throughout the day, not just work? And how do we build a system for all communities? Again, I think it's also, I think one thing I meant to say earlier too is another gap that we saw is folks who can't drive in rural areas or in isolated communities. Public transit isn't a solution for small communities necessarily, or not the same type of public transit. So I think, again, I use that as a last example just to say it gives us a great opportunity to say, what is the system that we want? What is the broad range of needs that we have to provide for people? And then how do we really rethink that now, not just fall back to the status quo of this is what we've done in the past, or these are the ways we've measured or considered what investments to make in the past, but instead to say, if nothing else, COVID-19 has been a massive disruption in every sector, right? Not just public health and transportation, but pretty much across the board. And it gives us an opportunity to respond kind of proactively and reevaluate what we're working and maybe go towards some of those other big goals that we've outlined.
Thank you, Kyle. Really appreciate your thoughts on that. Stephanie, I'm going to have you go next, and maybe you can give us, so we just talked a lot about transit, and I'm sure you have some experience with that as well, but I'd love to hear your inputs on kind of the work that you're doing in historic preservation along with affordable housing and climate.
Yes. Yes, this is such a big conversation topic, and I love that we're having it today. But I think just from our perspective in the work in heritage conservation and historic preservation that we're doing in San Antonio, I think the pandemic has really highlighted the critical importance of a healthy living environment, both from an indoor air quality perspective and also a community building and like community resiliency perspective. And so, for example, I'll use me. My home, I live in a 1925 craftsman house, and it has become my sanctuary, right? And my older neighborhood, which has, again, denser tree canopy, walkability, has become almost like a social haven for me and my neighbors in an otherwise very disconnected and fractured world. But not everyone is that fortunate. And affordable housing preservation and production in particular has become an absolute top priority in the city of San Antonio, as I'm sure it has in other communities. And we just passed a record housing bond that will divert hundreds of millions of dollars into affordable housing. So we're intimately involved in that discussion. And a big reason why is because we commissioned a study in 2019 that showed us that not only is affordable housing stock in San Antonio more vulnerable to demolition, but that same housing stock houses a greater proportion of our traditionally excluded and low-income residents. So it's imperative for our public health dollars to be funneled into rehabilitation and retrofitting programs, including improving energy efficiency, indoor air quality monitoring, and perhaps most importantly, just basic repair and maintenance, which is honestly a low-hanging fruit that makes a huge, huge, huge difference in healthy living, especially in older structures. So in addition to that, we are also leading a policy initiative to advance deconstruction instead of demolition. So if you're not familiar with deconstruction, it's my favorite topic, I could talk about it forever, but it's a method of building removal, which may seem in contrast to our office's mission, but I'll expound on that. But it's done by hand, by human labor, and it results in more material salvage and reuse. So you think about a building going up, stacking all of those things. Deconstruction is basically unbuilding in the opposite way and maximizing the potential to reuse those materials. And that's, of course, in contrast to traditional mechanical demolition, which we're all familiar with, which uses heavy machinery like an excavator and results in all of those materials being crushed on site and sent into landfills. And this is also an important public health and affordable housing conversation because just the way we decide to take buildings down increases the likelihood of safe hazardous material abatement because the removal of the building, again, is done by hand versus machines. And this is really, really critical when we apply a public health and equity lens because demolition is air pollution, like plain and simple. Studies from the EPA and the CDC have shown that traditional mechanical demolition generates lead and asbestos containing dust, and this dust can travel up to 600 feet from the source, entering open windows and settling into soil, permeating our groundwater. And this is really locally important as our county's overall asthma hospitalization rate is higher than all of Texas overall. And the effects of hazardous air particles are, of course, exacerbated by ozone action days. San Antonio gets really, really hot, and those are only growing, right? 100-degree plus days are only growing. And of course, also exacerbated by airborne illnesses like COVID. So when we talk about reusing our buildings or even deconstructing them, we are definitely talking about public health and environmental justice, in addition to waste reduction, workforce development, because deconstruction employs 6 times more people than demolition, and affordable housing preservation. And I think the last thing that I want to mention that ties into all of this that's been highlighted by the pandemic is just the need to democratize information on home maintenance. That seems like very obvious, but it is a huge issue. And that information definitely should be accessible and resources should be abundant. And a big part of our work is focusing on the proliferation of our traditional construction trades, as well as community trades education to kind of tackle those information asymmetries and really provide resources for our communities to kind of just maintain what is essentially often their primary source of generational wealth.
Amazing. Thank you, Stephanie. As I mentioned to her in private, historical preservation was something that I was least familiar with, but as she graciously let me know that some of it, I think we all kind of understand the basic premise behind some of what she said and the benefits that it has to public health after what she just spoke about. So finally, we'll have Lindsey talk about this question. And Lindsey obviously has a public health background and maybe give some general context, even though I know you do have also a lot of knowledge about transportation and zoning policies.
Yeah, and I just want to say I really appreciate the perspectives of the other panelists on here. I think you guys have all mentioned some really important concepts and points. I think I'm going to take a little bit of a broader view, and you know, I'm not sure how much this has happened, but I would hope that COVID has been a reflective point for a lot of planners to recognize the sort of historical roots of planning and themselves were sort of born out of infectious disease, and that, you know, like these ties and these connections have always fundamentally been part of planning practice. Planning, like legal framework, was, you know, born out of the time of cholera and typhoid. And so I think hopefully it's a reminder that these public health and planning disciplines are so intrinsically tied to each other. And, you know, another thing that I've thought about a lot or seen more attention to as a result of COVID in terms of planning and urban form has been around, you know, urban density and whether that is a risk factor for, you know, increased disease prevalence, and especially with a highly infectious disease like COVID. And it's sort of interesting to me because some early research published in 2020 showed that while higher density cities had higher infection rates, they actually had lower mortality rates from COVID. And I think some of the, you know, hypotheses that they had around that was that people in cities just have generally better access to healthcare resources. And I think, you know, for me, that makes rural areas just don't have as, and even suburban areas don't have as close access. And to some of Julia's points earlier that she was saying, and sometimes the public transportation access isn't as good as it could be, but ultimately it's a lot better than in places that don't have that, you know, urban infrastructure. And so I think it would be my hope is that there's not this short-sighted, you know, change that happens where people are saying we should have less dense urban areas because it's actually increased health risk. I actually hope the response is that density can be very health promoting. And also as a reflection of just, you know, let me take a step back. So the other thing that I think is a really interesting tie into this is this concept that I learned about a decade ago, which is something called One Health. And the idea there is that, you know, we need to have a more comprehensive approach and recognition that the health of people is ultimately very closely connected to the health of animals and our surrounding environment. So when you think about urban sprawl and the growth of metropolitan areas over the last 50 or 60 years and how much it's been, you know, the natural areas have been intruded on by urban development, we're becoming, you know, more and more in contact with other animals and species that sometimes carry infectious diseases that end up getting transferred to us. So I think it's an important time to reflect on, you know, the idea of urban growth boundaries and how we actually create more density in cities to protect natural areas so that we don't keep getting more avian flus and more swine, you know, like all these flus and a lot of coronaviruses are ultimately tied to, you know, like animal viral populations. So I think this is an important time to reflect on some of those concepts as planners as well, and the role that land use planning and transportation planning has played in that urban sprawl that in some ways is very much tied to this. And that has a lot to do with climate change resiliency planning also. You know, the spread of a lot of vector-borne diseases is highly tied to our warming climate. So how can we as planners do climate resiliency in a way that is health promoting? I think there's just a lot of connections in that way. And then the last thing I wanted to mention, that's sort of riffing off of something that Kyle mentioned in terms of the importance of access to green space and trails. One thing that I'm sure other people have noticed during the pandemic was sort of how cities started this shared street sort of small pilots. It's a common concept in Europe to do more shared streets where bicyclists and pedestrians have sort of right away over the public road. And, Chicago experimented with it a little bit. And my hope is that that becomes more of a normal concept and a strategy to really create more public physical activity space in urban areas. Because I know that in my neighborhood where it was implemented, it was pretty heavily utilized as a space for people to walk and meet and to get their physical activity in, which was very much needed during COVID. So that was the last thing I just wanted to mention.
Thank you very much, Lindsey. So next up, I have a question that's going to be directed at Stephanie specifically. And so if you could, and you've touched on this a little bit already, but I just want to highlight some of the things that are kind of elements of what you do. And so given the negative historical investments in the built environment, so we're thinking about urban sprawl, highways, large lot sizes, suburban development, what are some elements of past practices do you believe we should keep or maintain to improve both the built environment and public health?
Yes, I love this question. And there are a lot of different ways that we could tackle that, but I think something that's unique, and it kind of builds off of what we've heard about, how the historical roots of planning. A lot of the work that we do focuses on studying the development of history. It's just innate in, heritage conservation as a subset of planning. And we have been engaging kind of with sustainable practices, including adaptive reuse, material conservation, traditional crafts and traditional trades as kind of like this element of living heritage for decades. And the built environment really does bear the mark of centuries of hazardous events, including flash flooding, droughts, violent storms. Those are the most common, at least in Central Texas. And so we have this knowledge of past climate adaptations. So we're trying to harness that information into addressing the challenges of climate change now, especially as it impacts our specific city. And we like to say that cultural heritage anchors social memory and cohesion, which informs community identity and instills kind of this sense of place. And this goes way back to the idea of social determinants of health. A sense of place and a sense of community and a sense of social cohesion is really essential in sustaining inherent resilience. It's a key part of how we can come together, be more intersectional to tackle this massive, massive crisis. So I think something that our field, hearkening back to things that can mitigate the negative impacts in our cities, we really want to focus on localizing economic activity, particularly the revival of our building trades, right? I have an architectural background. So much of building education these days focuses on how to build new buildings with new materials that are often petroleum-based and single-use. And we talk about single-use plastic all the time. There was a really great article with it. This is a clickbaity headline, but why are our buildings single-use, right? Like, how can we take that mentality and apply it to our cities? And this ties into kind of our conversation today because, our world, this is such a shocking stat to me, is currently only 8.6% circular, meaning we only use 8.6% of what we take from the earth, and the remaining 91.4% is wasted. It's just landfilled. And that is not any way to tackle a massive climate crisis. And ultimately, all waste legislation is aimed at preventing health and pollution risks. And the transition to kind of this new economy, circular economy, has implications on how people access and consume and value their existing resources, including buildings, right? So I've mentioned circular economy. I just want to define it quickly in case anyone is unfamiliar with it. It's an economic system that aims to reduce waste and maximize resources by prioritizing product longevity, reuse, repair, and renewability. All of the re's that come before recycling, right? So think about even better than recycling. How can we repair, renew, restore? And this is really critical because that kind of thinking helps regenerate our natural systems and ultimately helps us decouple resource use from economic growth. So we start reframing how our cities and our societies behave. And of course, this is in contrast to how we largely live right now, which is take, make, waste. We mine our earth for natural resources. We make products for a singular use. Someone determines that they no longer serve a purpose, and then we throw them away. And the best way to challenge this thinking is to reuse what we already have, right? We have started to refer to our cities as urban forests or urban mines, where we're working on reframing how we see our cities as kind of resources and ultimately removing waste from the equation. And that goes to how can we reuse our existing buildings? And if we can't do that for other reasons, because we can't save everything, I know that better than anyone, how can we recapture some of the things that are being removed from those sites and redirect them back into our cities? And that is a really specific subset of our field that I think is really critical to growing conversations around public health, because waste really is a critical component of that discussion.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Stephanie. All right, I really want to get to this next question. We don't have too much time left, but I do want to ask, we still have 2 more questions left, and I really want to get to this next one. And it's specifically going to be directed at Kyle and Julia. Now, the question is, how can transportation and or planning policies change from an institutional level to better support public health outcomes? And we'll start with Kyle here.
Thanks, Henry. Stephanie, that's all really awesome work that you guys are doing. It's the first time I've sort of heard folks talk about that, so that's really powerful. One of the things I wanted to add to that touches on this question as well for me is one of the big challenges that we have when we think about changing policies and changing the way we approach transportation is some of the historic patterns. And one of the things that I also think we too rarely talk about when we think about changing these big patterns is sort of the sacrifices that people need to make, the sacrifices people have been asked or forced to make in the past, and then the ones that we would all collectively need to make to actually change things. And one of the things I think about from a planning perspective is, obviously like environmental justice issues and unwanted land uses in places, whether it's a highway or a landfill or a concrete batch plant, which is a problem in Houston and many other communities. I'm sure most of the folks on this call know that those have predominantly fallen in lower income and non-white communities in the United States' history and globally. And I think part of my answer to this question about changing planning policies is that we also need to grapple with how do we actually not just mitigate and recognize those previous challenges, but also think about, do we need the same types of systems going forward, right? And maybe, as Stephanie was saying, moving towards other options to minimize those impacts for everybody. But then also really grappling with the reality of those costs should be shared more broadly, right? I'm not saying I want everybody to be exposed to health issues, but right now what we also often see is sort of the collection and the sustained impact of negative outcomes from those bad uses, right? Like as somebody said earlier, highways are pollution, sites of pollution, right? And there's no avoiding that. And so thinking about what we so often do is just simply reiterate on top of the exact same places where projects have gone before without really grappling with, like, is this still the most appropriate site? Is this still the most appropriate use? And that's where, for me, it goes back to this question of, like, how do we change that status quo and talk with people about, like, yes, this is a compromise, we're changing. There may need to be some new route or new approach to this, and it may change our daily lives. But again, to my big shared goals idea, if we have this big shared goal, we have to make some of those tough decisions. So that's a very 10,000 foot view answer of that. But I think it's really critical to put in there. The other thing I would put in here too, really as a more nitty gritty piece, is really just changing the metrics we use to evaluate our decisions and to evaluate our projects, right? So the best example, the most concrete example I could give in transportation is, most road investments and infrastructure decisions are made by how many vehicles are put through at a given time, right? So something as simple as starting to shift that. So asking engineers and planners to say, if vehicle throughput, what the technical version of that measure, is not the sole thing we're aiming to do with our projects, what else can we add to that, or what could replace that, and how does that change the projects that we're creating, right? So if you can give this a frame through multiple ways, right? So it could be a vision zero frame, and you could say the outcome that we want, the measure that we're going to build projects for, is as few injuries and fatalities on this system as possible. So what does that mean? What type of system do you create, right? So there's a plethora of metrics you could use to do that, but I think that's a really critical exercise for planners and engineers to undertake together and to think about how we value and prioritize those different measures, because that directly changes the types of projects that we have, right? So it may be a lower speed street, or it may be something that's more dependent on transit and active transportation than on individual cars, right? It also changes the context, and it changes by context and changes by the type of project you're doing as well. But there's a really big need to just shift how we measure success, what we think of as success, and how we measure it.
Thanks, Kyle. All right, Julia, do you want to add anything to that question?
Yeah, I mean, Kyle, totally agree, especially on the how we evaluate projects in which we choose to implement point. I guess just even looking beyond that, though, I think we have to think more broadly than just the policies, right? So in Chicago, for example, we have a complete streets policy, which means we should be building our streets or improving our streets according to this modal hierarchy, with pedestrians being the most vulnerable, right? And freight and truck traffic being the least. And yet we still see our local transportation agency making compromises on projects that jeopardize the safety of pedestrians due to the lack of accountability mechanisms in this policy. So I think there's still huge barriers to overcome in terms of just like inertia within these agencies, where there are people who have been working there for many decades or are a single voice in this sea of like, let's just keep doing things the same way we've been doing, right? And we're at this influx point of all these federal funds coming in from the Infrastructure and Investment Jobs Act, right? And it's kind of being left up to the individual states to decide how those funds are going to be spent. And just to be really, I guess, candid, IDOT, the Illinois Department of Transportation, is quite impenetrable, even though they also have a complete streets policy. So I think it's a matter of political will and building that as well, to have our leaders really be taking a critical view of how these agencies operate. And it can't just be, you know, one candidate or one single politician who will be able to change this. This is really going to have to be a systemic or transformative change. So I would argue it's not just about the policies, it's about the political will and the culture within these agencies that are implementing the policies as well.
Amazing. Thank you, Julia. Okay, so I'm just gonna, I want people who are on this Zoom to kind of something to take away from, like just something they can really think about that's really concrete. And so really quickly, I'm just gonna ask, we don't really, I wanna make sure there's time for questions. So really quickly, under 30 seconds. And I know this is a challenging question to do that in 30 seconds, but what is something that we as students, planners, researchers, advocates can start doing or thinking about today to achieve a more healthy and equitable future for our built environment? And I'm going to start with Lindsey here. Sorry, I changed up the order.
Yeah, this was a hard one, but I think ultimately, you know, I'm a big believer that we need to really dismantle the historical barriers and bureaucratic silos that separate planning and public health, and so and make it easier for us to work together. So I feel like if someone's on this call and they want to make a difference, I would say, like, make a friend, make a professional connection with someone who works in public health or who works in planning, or, you know, whatever, vice versa. Go to a public health event, invite public health people to your planning event. And I think making those connections and having those conversations are like the first step in like bridging that gap. And ultimately for me, I think that's my biggest, obviously I'm a planner with like a public health background, but that would be my biggest takeaway.
Thank you. Stephanie?
Lindsey stole my idea. No, I'm just kidding. It's the same thing, because I think this is really critical, is just being more intersectional, like 100%. It's the old adage, you can go fast alone, but you can go further together. And the less siloed we are, the more effective we can be in creating more equitable and systemic change, like what Julia was just talking about. And for example, like one way I hold myself accountable is I remind myself, like, be the only preservationist in the room, like just take up space, go to these places that Lindsey was just mentioning and, forge those contacts and be open to their perspectives, because it is absolutely has transformed the way that we conduct business in our office. And it really anchors us as planners that know that we can't do it from our own perspective. We have to do it together. So yes, intersectionality is the best.
Thank you. Julia?
Okay, let's see here. Yeah, I really appreciate what both Lindsey and Stephanie have shared so far. And just, I guess, centering the voices of those who are most impacted and building those relationships over time. Kind of like the adage Stephanie shared, I go back to Adrienne Marie Brown's move at the speed of trust, right? And it's all about the follow-up, right? So how are you showing these residents that you actually will use their input, come back and try to make that change, and compensating them for their time too. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Julia. And Kyle, to finish us off?
Yeah, I was going to build off something Stephanie said, which I think for planners in particular, being in conversations where folks are taking the plans and implementing them and understanding sort of, I think Julia said, folks have been doing the work in many cases for decades, right? And have been in communication with colleagues and peers who have been saying, okay, here's how we're doing it, right? And so going to those conversations and going to those implementers of your plans and of the conversations and understanding where it is they're coming from and how they've been approaching things, and talking with them about why you're suggesting changing metrics or why a different project is accomplishing goals in a different way, instead of, I think in many cases, it's very easy to be like, I can't believe we're still doing this project this way. And, this is such a terrible outcome, because you're basically framing, I'm going to use a very concrete case example of like, you're saying to a traffic engineer, you've been killing people for 60 years, right? As opposed to, this is the program and projects we've asked you to build for 60 years. And now we need to talk about how we're getting different outcomes and meeting different goals. And so I think I would just echo that, go have those conversations and be a part of those discussions, and don't just expect that if you say, hey, this is a really good idea and an important goal, that people will be able to embrace it and implement it in their daily lives and work, because they need to also be brought along and understand your perspective and where you're coming from.
Amazing. Thank you all so much. This has been really great. I do want to now open it up for questions. I know we have a little bit less time. I apologize. So if anyone does have a question, please feel free to unmute yourselves. So you can unmute yourself if you can. Please have your camera on. Of course, you don't have to. You can also write your questions in the chat and we can pull them up from there. You could raise your hand too, and that can give me an idea. Don't go all at once.
I have a question. So I know we've been I think the pandemic, obviously, as we've been talking about, really brought public health to the forefront of our thoughts. I was wondering in discussion of things like mental and social health as connected to public health, what ways do you think planners and advocates can use the built environment to help people, with socialization and just other aspects of mental health?
Whoever feels best equipped to answer that, you are welcome to unmute yourself.
I'll take a first stab at that. I think going back to something that Kyle had mentioned about access to green space and opportunities to be physically active, and also something Stephanie had mentioned about building neighborhood cohesion. I think a lot of that is very much tied to how planners, approach urban form, think about neighborhoods holistically as places of community gatherings and socialization. But I think really access to green space and physical activity, there's just more and more evidence that comes out all the time at the importance of those things on the daily basis. and exposure to those things on a regular basis for like improved mental health outcomes. So I think that for me is like the easiest low-hanging fruit from that perspective. But yeah, I mean, social cohesion and social isolation it's an interesting budding field within people who are interested in urban design. And I don't know if there's a ton of takeaways from that now, but it's certainly an avenue that a lot of people are actually really fascinated and interested in. And I'm sure COVID is only going to sort of explode that interest in general.
I guess I'll just add that I think it's important to like center the joy of what it feels like to use active transportation. So from, taking a bike ride with friends on a trail to even just riding transit and you see somebody reading a book that you've read and you make a connection that way, right? I think it's pretty obvious that cars isolate us, but all the other modes that we work to promote just by their very nature bring joy and connection. So I think that's kind of obvious, but just wanted to throw that out there.
Of course. Thank you, Julia. All right, and Lindsey for the answering that question. Does anyone else have any questions? We probably have time for one more if we do. Otherwise, I will get everyone out here on time. I think the only question that's I see in the chat is Julia was wondering, Stephanie, what's your cat's name?
This is Pearl.
Cute. So it does look like we do have a question. Barry, you want to ask your question? I think you just unmuted yourself. Sorry, Barry. You were unmuted and now you are muted.
Okay.
There you go.
Yes. What I'm asking is, what about bringing back the idea of bus rapid transit? It seems like that's one of the ways we could have commutes between areas that are not between downtowns, from neighborhood to neighborhood.
Couldn't agree more, Barry. Yep. I think a major hurdle in Chicago is, of course, our parking meter deal, where a lot of our street space is owned by a private company for what, I think 40 more years, something like that. Yeah. And so that makes it tough to reclaim that street space away from those parking spots for bus lanes. But we had a campaign commitment from Mayor Lightfoot to build at least 30 miles of bus lanes. We've still got about a year left of her term, so we're trying to hold her accountable to it. So I hope you join us in the agitation.
Thank you.
All right, does anyone else want to add to that? Okay. All right. Okay. All right. Well, I just want to say thank you all so much again for this incredibly informative and important discussion, in my opinion. I'm so grateful to each of our panelists and to all of you who attended. Just want to give the panelists again just another round of applause. Like you can do, throw some stuff in the chat, but thank you all so much for taking the time out of your day. I know you're all super busy. Now, I also want to take a moment to thank the organizers of this event. And for the tireless work we're putting together, and the rest of my UPPSA team members and their help with this panel. I also want to shout out that there is another panel after this one, and I can actually share my screen again to show you, but that will be on after. There's another panel at 1:30, and then there are 2 additional panels tomorrow at the same times as today. So if you're interested in learning more about the panelists, please visit the Urban Innovation Symposium website, as well as the UPPSA website, which was put in the chat. And I just want to say thank you again so much for attending. It's been really great to see you all here. And I look forward to more conversations in the future, especially around the intersections between public health and planning.